Even if your childhood was after the Tragically Hip's 90s heyday, it is impossible to grow up Canadian and not be exposed to their music somehow, some way at a young age.
When you blow it hydro, happy, happy, carry my word. And 500 more will crash. I left your house this morning.
They've been dubbed Canada's band, with 9 of their 13 albums topping the Canadian charts, and each of their first 3 albums being certified diamond, having sold more albums in the country than U2. Much of their lyrical content is also steeped in Canadiana, often in ways only Canadians can embrace and understand. Their late frontman Gord Downie is also one of the most beloved and celebrated poets the country has ever seen. But the band's biggest and arguably most recognizable tune is 1996's Ahead by a Century, a song about 2 young children sitting in a tree, thinking about the past, present, and future, has etched itself into the collective imagination of the Hip's home country pretty much ever since its release. The ultimate soundtrack for young love in the middle of fall. Let's dive into what led to the song's creation and the legacy it's left behind. The Hip started playing an early version of Ahead by a Century in 1995. By then, the band, consisting of Downie, guitarists Paul Langlois and Rob Baker, drummer Johnny Fay, and bassist Gord Sinclair, yes, there were 2 Gords in the band, were on a 4-album hot streak, capped off by September 1994's Day for Night and a famous performance on Saturday Night Live that followed, introduced to viewers by fellow Canuck Dan Aykroyd.
It is my honor to introduce to America my friends, the Tragically Hip.
After this, the Hip got to work on their 5th studio album. During that process, Gord Downie and co. finished a tune that had originated as a musical idea emerging from impromptu jam sessions the band would often have while performing another of their biggest songs, New Orleans is Sinking.
New Orleans is sinking, man, and I don't wanna swim.
The song Gord had been writing from that jam was, at its core, about young love and the passage of time. Writing songs through the lens of a child was something that had come increasingly naturally for the band, as several members were becoming dads around that time. The song starts with 2 kids deciding to climb a tree, a childlike activity in the truest sense, and either have a chat or just chill there in silence. It's a song about youth and nostalgia, but also about sitting in a tree envisioning all of life's future possibilities. It's also about living fully and, yes, completely in the moment. Ahead by a Century explores the concept of life itself through a child's eyes, excited about the future, but also embracing right here, right now. After all, this is our life, and we only get one. No dress rehearsal, as Gord says.
No dress rehearsal.
But then, a pesky, stinging insect terrorizes our protagonist and gives him a full-on fever dream from allergies.
And that's where the hornet stung me.
Being stung by a hornet brings him back down to earth, and realizes that the other person is ahead by a century, meaning more in the moment and enjoying life than him, and possibly also more mature. The line about smoking hornets out references the idea that shooting smoke into a hornet's nest will get rid of everyone inside. In other words, the kind of thing you absolutely should not do unless you're a professional. Nonetheless, this kid is determined to do exactly that to any lingering feelings of doubt and or vindictiveness. The second verse shows the 2 kids realizing they have feelings for one another and holding each other's hands one morning. But then, in a classic example of planning a pretty picnic while being unable to predict the weather, rain starts pouring on them both. A metaphor for the curveballs and hardships life throws our way. During the last chorus, we hear Gord sing, "And disappointing you's getting me down," a sad sign that our protagonist is so far behind his friend on so many levels that nothing he does for her feels like it'll ever be enough anymore. Like he's a constant disappointment to her at this point.
And disappointing you's getting me down.
Originally, the lyrics, specifically the opening exchange between the 2 kids in the tree, were much more sexual in nature, and the song's earliest incarnations had been played live with those lyrics intact. But Gord reworked them after the band's guitar technician talked him out of using them, fearing the X-rated imagery would distract listeners too much. Gord then spent the next week trying to flip those lyrics into something more kid-friendly. Quote, "The weird thing is, I loved every minute of it. It was a sweating workout on that song, and it was frustrating and it was weird, but I loved it because it was a challenge that I had created for myself and that I met. And ultimately, the song achieved kinda what I wanted it to. You only have so much room to say what you want to say, so I like economy and conciseness. That's sort of where I'm at now. Let's just say the results were well worth the trouble.
First thing we climb a tree.
Ahead by a Century was released on April 22nd, 1996, as the lead single from the Tragically Hip's fifth album, Trouble at the Hen House, which came out soon thereafter on May 7th. Ahead by a Century topped Canada's singles chart that July, giving the Hip their first #1 song. It would also be one of the most played songs on Canadian radio in all of 1996. 20 years later, it would finally be certified platinum in Canada. The song's music video very much matches the vibe of the track and was filmed on a farm about an hour northeast of Toronto in Brooklyn, Ontario, eventually winning Best Video at the 1996 Much Music Video Awards. They'd perform it on some major stages both literally and metaphorically in the years to come, including at Live 8 in 2005 and the infamously calamitous Woodstock 99 6 years earlier in Rome, New York, to a crowd draped in Canadian flags. It's also been sung by a children's choir in a Canadian Tire commercial and used in the CBC's coverage of the 2016 Summer Olympics in Rio de Janeiro.
Alexia going for the medal, going for silver, where will she touch?
And as the theme song for the CBC and Netflix series Anne with an E.
This is our life.
The song even has a wine named after it by Ontario's Stony Ridge Estate Winery, one of their numerous hip-themed wines. Another quintessentially Canadian artist, the rapper Chaos, immortalized the track further in 2004 by name-dropping it in his hit song Crab Bucket, alongside references to Leonard Cohen and Toronto's Yonge Street.
See, tragically hip ahead by a century.
Most notably, the song was the set closer for the band's final concert on August 20th, 2016 in their hometown of Kingston, Ontario. Broadcasted nationally by the CBC and with public watch parties in big cities and small towns alike nationwide.
Well, I did the set list for the last tour, so I guess I chose for it to be the last song of the tour, and I think all the other guys like that idea too. It just kind of sums things up somehow for us, and it's a sing-along song, of course. So we just thought it'd be quite an appropriate way to end it. You know, it represents a lot to all of us, I think. It was on the only record that we produced ourselves, and everyone in the band had a key part in it and in the writing of it. So we just always felt good about that one. And it was kind of like, felt like the start of the second half of our career.
About 9 months earlier, Gord Downie had been diagnosed with terminal glioblastoma, an aggressive and very deadly type of brain cancer. News that reverberated across Canada. The band went on one last Canadian tour, while Gord underwent rigorous fitness tests to be well enough to perform, and having to relearn his own songs due to memory problems. His performance of Ahead by a Century that night, and especially how it ended, is something that remains etched into the hearts and minds of many Canadians since. Soon after that show in Kingston, Ahead by a Century re-entered the Canadian charts at number 32. On October 17th, 2017, Gord Downie passed away. The news of his death sending a country into widespread mourning. Tributes flowed in not just from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who attended their final show in Kingston, but also from some of our biggest celebrities. Among them Ryan Reynolds, Seth Rogen, Will Arnett, Sarah McLachlan, and yes, Dan Aykroyd. Clearly, the Hip are entrenched firmly in Canada's national identity, especially when the influence of our next-door neighbors still looms large over our culture. Hell, even Justin Bieber covered them live once, as Wheat Kings is the first song he ever learned to play on guitar.
Kings and pretty things.
But unlike someone like Bieber or Seth Rogen or Ryan Reynolds, the Hip never had to move to New York or LA to be widely embraced by folks in their own country. In many ways, the Hip were like a joke whose punchline only we got. After Gord's death, people internationally started taking more notice of the band. The BBC published a tribute to him, and more reaction videos have popped up in recent years of American creators reacting to the Hip's songs. Ahead by a Century also got a placement in the Umbrella Academy during its fourth and final season.
With revenge and death.
As much as the Hip are woven into Canada's national fabric, Ahead by a Century carries universal themes of childhood nostalgia and isn't overtly told from Gord's trademark hyper-Canadian lens. This, of course, is something that prevented the Hip from achieving international success despite the fact that musically, the band owe a great deal of debt to various British and American acts. Ahead by a Century isn't just the Tragically Hip's first #1 single in their home country, it's one of the most accessible tunes in their back catalog. This makes it all the more frustrating it didn't have a bigger impact globally, after not quite breaking America following their SNL performance. Ahead by a Century has gotten the cover treatment on multiple occasions as well.
And I had a feverish dream. Tonight we smoke them out. You are ahead by a century. Yeah, she let me do you did. You are ahead by a century.
A few years back, guitarist Rob Baker even challenged all of TikTok to cover the song for a duet with him.
This is our life.
But Ahead by a Century was covered perhaps most notably by American singer-songwriter Tori Amos in 2017.
You are ahead by a century. You are ahead by a century.
She performed it specifically for her show in Toronto soon after Gord's passing, having learned the song from scratch as she had never previously heard it, further underscoring the shocking contrast with the Hip's recognition between both sides of the border.
Tonight we smoke in my
The Hip were part of an elite club of bands to have a career full of both popular radio hits and fan-favorite deep cuts, making for one of the most subjective discographies in the eyes of fans. One Hip fan's list of their favorite songs by the band will likely look quite different from the next. Nonetheless, Ahead by a Century is arguably their signature song. It's also, of course, referenced in the title of the new Hip docuseries now streaming on Amazon Prime Video, No Dress Rehearsal. Hearing those opening acoustic guitar strums is an instantly recognizable sound for many a Canuck, and one that, for me, recalls autumn not unlike how Len Steal My Sunshine does with summer. It's also a song that illustrates how, over the course of a generation since forming in the 80s, the Hip have captured the hearts and minds of so many Canadians who identified in some way, even if subconsciously, with Gord's storytelling. Maybe the Tragically Hip were always just ahead of their time, perhaps even by a century.